Now, Congressman Lee, you may be best known nationally for something you did in your second term of Congress in 2001. You were the only member who opposed authorization for military action after 9/11, and people still talk about that. But how do you feel about that decision now?
That was the correct decision then. It's still the correct decision when you look at what has taken place. If you remember, right after the horrific events of 9/11, Congress came forward with a resolution, which really was a blank check. It was 60 words, and basically what it said is the president, any president, could use force against any nation, any organization, individual, really forever, as long as they could make a connection to 9/11. Well, it's been used now over 41 times all around the world, in Yemen, in Niger, in places we don't even know we have troops. And so what I am saying is that we need to go back to the drawing board now. We need to repeal that resolution. And if we're going to be engaged in these wars, Congress must debate and vote up or down on new authorizations. And last year we had bipartisan support for that amendment that I put into the appropriations bill. And guess what? Speaker Ryan just took it out, a 326-page bill, voted in by Democrats and Republicans, and more than likely it was at the orders of Donald Trump, because they follow his lead on everything. They just took it out. So we're going to do it again this year. Sooner or later, we will repeal that.
Oh, I was going to bring that up because Politico magazine is calling you an army of one on this issue. And yeah, you're getting some support. So that's the latest from the front line. This fight continues.
It continues, not only as it relates to Afghanistan and the Taliban, it continues all around the world. As I said, in a declassified report, it's been used 41 times and growing in areas of the world where the public has no idea what we're doing. Our troops deserve to know that we have their back, or that we should bring them home, either way. And the public needs to know the costs and consequences of the wars that we're engaged in. But right now, Congress is missing in action, and they're AWOL, have not done its job. And so we're going to continue to work until we repeal that resolution and force Congress to do its job.
This week, President Trump withdrew the U.S. from the Iran nuclear agreement. You and I believe 7 other members of Congress immediately denouncing that. Why?
First, we do not want to see a nuclear-armed Iran. The JCPOA was a good, very focused agreement which the entire world came together to make sure that Iran could not acquire a nuclear weapon. The inspections have taken place at least 10 times. The international organization IAEA that inspects these weapons regimes and what's taking place have said 10 times and concluded Iran is complying with this agreement. And so we gave our word. Now we reneged. And the rest of the world is going to have to say in the future, can we trust the United States? We have now, as an American, we have to look to Europe to hope that and encourage Europe to stay in the deal so that we can really see a world that's free of nuclear weapons, at least from the Middle East and Iran, because this could create a new arms race in the Middle East. So it's wrong. It's isolated the United States. I mean, it's the United States now against the rest of the world pulling out from this deal. And I have no idea, other than it was President Obama's deal, why Donald Trump would do that when, in fact, it's been verified that Iran is compliant.
Well, you're making me think about the fact that earlier this year, the president ordered airstrikes on Syria on purported chemical facilities, and even the defense secretary thought he should have asked Congress first. So what are your thoughts on that? It almost seems as though Congress is losing control of military actions overseas.
This is, in many ways, Donald Trump is acting in an authoritarian fashion. He is making these decisions on his own and unilaterally taking actions that Congress should be at least involved in and debating and voting on. That's why, and for me personally, I just have to say, we've got to take back this House. Democrats must do that. We need a system of our system of checks and balances reinstituted, because right now they're just moving ahead, this president doing everything that he wants to do without even recognizing that, or I don't know if he really knows we have 3 branches of government and that we do have a system that requires a check on the executive branch. The Constitution requires us to do our job as it relates to war and peace, and this president does not even seem to care, nor does he understand.
President threatening to withdraw federal funding from UC Berkeley in your district unless it schedules controversial right-wing speakers. Can he do that without congressional approval? Can you do something to protect the university?
President thinks he can do anything, and let me tell you, we're pushing back on everything that he's doing. He's trying to sanction and withdraw federal funds from sanctuary cities, for example, sanctuary states. He's trying to penalize, for example, those who are on SNAP benefits by saying they must work, the work requirements in the Farm Bill, when in fact 60-70% of people on SNAP benefits are children, the disabled, and seniors. And so he's trying to really, as Steve Bannon reminded us, he's not in the White House now, but of course he was. He and Gorka and Steve Miller, their whole thing is deconstructing the administrative state, which means making sure the federal government is really, there's no role for the federal government. And so they're trying to deny federal funding on a variety of fronts, including the university.
And that reminds me, you have been very strong about supporting federal funding for more programs to support housing, for the homeless, for people with disabilities. But there does appear to be a strong core of people who simply refuse to take advantage of those programs. How do we deal with that?
Well, right now we need more funding for those programs. We don't have enough. The homelessness is a very serious issue, and it takes a comprehensive, all-hands-on-deck approach. Now, a couple of things that we're doing in Congress. One is trying to make the Department of Housing and Urban Development, headed by Ben Carson, who really does not believe in public housing, trying to get them more resources, get them to do their job as it relates to homelessness. We have an interagency council on homelessness that I'm trying to get extended, which brings forth all the federal agencies, including Health and Human Services, to really provide the mental health care that's needed. But I have to tell you, in many ways, the new homeless are people who have been evicted because of the cost of housing and gentrification and displacement. It's tragic. And so what I have done is introduced a resolution calling for a renter's Bill of Rights, so that the federal government will understand that they've got to come up with policies that allow for affordable housing and where people can stay in their homes and not be evicted and be able to pay their rent. And right now, you see people who have been made homeless with their sofas and their chairs, people who have been living in their homes or apartments now have been evicted and are living in the streets. Housing, affordable housing should be a basic human right. And so we've got to do better. And the federal government does have a responsibility. And so people need the support at the local level to make it work. But it has to be comprehensive.
You have condemned those recent federal raids on suspected undocumented immigrants in the East Bay, Congresswoman. It seems like most of the Bay Area agrees with you, except when the immigrants are involved in violent or systematic criminal activity. Would you support enforcement activities by La Migra if they were focused on criminal activity, not immigration itself?
Well, let me tell you, we have laws that address criminal activity. So what the heck does it mean if you're an immigrant or not an immigrant if you're committing crimes? And so immigrants should be treated under our criminal justice system as anyone else. We have very strong criminal justice laws. We have strong public safety laws. And so everyone should be accountable. I can't understand why you single out criminals from one category versus another. You prosecute and you arrest people based on what the laws require.
You know, when those raids fade from the headlines, we don't tend to hear what happened, like how many people were deported, arrested, or went back to their lives. Is that anything we really know about?
Well, I assume the Department of Homeland Security knows, but I tell you, in my district, I know people are very fearful. Our young people are anxious. We don't know when ICE is going to decide to raid, and you know, it's a terrible operation that's taking place. And so I think that the federal government is being disingenuous because they're not putting out the information and they're not telling us what is going on. But they should not conduct these raids. It's inhumane, and that's why I'm proud that I represent sanctuary cities. The majority of my cities in my district are sanctuary cities, and we do not allow ICE to come in and raid our communities. We push them back as strongly as we can.
Oh, gas tax. Let's mention that California, of course, recently raised the gas tax. I think the Democratic candidates, all of them, endorsing that, Congresswoman. Republicans arguing it's not fair, especially to lower-income residents. Have you taken a position on the gas tax increase?
I haven't taken necessarily a political position on it, but I think we need to have some balance. I mean, we need to make sure that people can afford, because the cost of oil now and gas is going to go up as a result of us pulling out of the Iran deal. But we have to make sure people can afford to get to their workplaces or drive wherever they are going. But we need the tax for infrastructure, and we need it to fix our roads, and we need gas taxes create jobs also. And so I think we have to have that balance, and people have to be able to pay for their fuel and their gasoline, but it should not be exorbitant. And I don't think this gas tax is exorbitant.
What about the high-speed rail project? That's going to require federal and state funding. You might argue that that's a lot of public money that could be better used elsewhere. Any thoughts on that?
I've always supported high-speed rail, even though it's controversial, but I think, it helps the environment. It gets people out of the cars. We've got to keep it where it's affordable. When you look at the congestion to and from the Central Valley, and when you look at the stress around driving 2 and 3 hours a day to work, it's terrible. How do people live a happy and healthy life if you're driving back and forth so much? So I think high-speed rail will really be a win-win for everyone. And again, I think it will help reduce the cost of living for so many people who really, right now, living in California is getting to be a real problem.
All right, you're making me think about Amtrak. Emeryville, obviously a hub for existing passenger service. The Trump administration seems inclined to eliminate or reduce in that category. Can you protect Amtrak?
We're going to try. Again, we have to have this House of Representatives and Senate has got to put a check on this president. And so by electing more Democrats in November, yeah, we can really put a stop to what this president is trying to do. As I said, he's trying to take away the federal role in everything. He's trying to privatize the entire federal government. This is becoming a government of corporations, of the private sector, and of the military. They're really eroding the public sector in terms of domestic spending. And so we have to push back on that. And believe you me, I think there'll be bipartisan support to push back.
Are you, and you don't have to answer if you don't want to, are you favoring a particular candidate in the upcoming primary, the governor's race?
I have not endorsed any candidate.
That's fine. You are a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. I know you've been very strong in talking about equal opportunity and diversity in Silicon Valley. What needs to be done to make sure that there is more diversity, that more African Americans are getting a shot at working in the tech industry?
You know, I have been dealing with this since the 90s because my district is right next to Silicon Valley. And many of my African American and Latino constituents have been trying to get jobs and break into the Silicon Valley industry and have been denied opportunities every step of the way. And so several years ago, I instituted with the Black Caucus Tech 2020. Basically, our mission is inclusion, racial equity in the tech sector. And so we have brought out several members of the Black Caucus. We've met with many tech companies, and some are doing better than others, but for the most part, it's dismal. When you look at an industry with, say, 2 to 3% African American and Latino workforce population, when you look at the fact that very few venture capitalists are investing in startups by African Americans and Latinos, when you look at their business contracts, very few minorities receive the contracts. And then when you look at the boards of directors of these tech sector companies, I remember on one visit, and I have to say, and I'm not calling the name of the company, but we had visited this company before and said, look, you've got to have diversity on the board. Lo and behold, the next year we visited it, they had 4 openings for board members. Not one was an African American, not one. Some of these companies have gone backwards, but believe you me, we're talking about regulation now. we're talking about a hammer now, because we've tried for years and years and years to make sure that they voluntarily saw that inclusion and racial equity was not necessarily their moral obligation, but it's also part of their growth, and that they should do this because if they don't really care about diversity in general, their economic growth is dependent on people of color, and so they've got to do better, and we're going to keep working with them.
Speaking of jobs, state and national unemployment, the numbers tell us, is really quite low right now. But a lot of people, especially African American men, are struggling to find jobs. Racism is clearly a factor. Are there other factors? What else needs to be done?
One is we need to ban the box on all job forms, interview forms, job applications, because so many, unfortunately, African American men have been incarcerated, have done their time, they're out in the workforce now, and there's so many barriers for the job market. I mean, I can remember, well, even now, when you get out of jail nationally, I think California finally did the right thing, but you're ineligible for life for Pell Grants, for food stamps, for public housing. I mean, you don't even have a second chance. So one, we need to reduce and remove all the barriers. Secondly, we need to invest more in workforce training and apprenticeship training. Going back to the tech sector, 40% of the jobs or more in the tech sector are non-tech related, yet they still aren't hiring African Americans and people of color in those jobs. And so we have to have apprenticeship programs, and we have to have some kind of measures to allow the to require the tech companies to look at, applicants of color who really don't need the PhDs and aren't the engineers. And three, we have to really look at systemic and institutional racism in our country. We still haven't dealt with that. There's so many biases. We need, some companies now and organizations are doing unconscious bias training, which is good because it really helps people understand what their unconscious biases are. But then there's no follow-up. You do 3 or 4 hours training and then boom, that's it. So when you look at the black community in terms of jobs, you have African Americans working as the wage gap, minimum wage, working 2 and 3 jobs, still not making a decent living. And you look at African American women, the wage gap is still huge. Latinas, Latino men. I mean, the wage gap with communities of color, people of color and in the Bay Area, it's terrible, and it's getting worse. This is a high-cost area. Everyone deserves a living wage and a path out of poverty into the middle class. And in California, it's going in just the opposite direction for people of color.
A lot of politicians talk about their activities and their hobbies, and you're usually associated with the more serious stuff. So go ahead and tell us something fun. Tell us something fun about Barbara Lee.
Wow, I love music, and I love plants and flowers and painting, and I have that creative side of Barbara Lee that really I received when I graduated from high school, music scholarships. I'm a pretty accomplished pianist, and my late Mother's Day weekend, one thing I regret before she passed away, she kept saying, "Barbara, you've got to get back to practicing your piano," because I was a fairly decent pianist. So I haven't done that yet, though.
I think you should think about that.
Yeah.
Thank you. You were just lovely, and thank you so much for doing this. We appreciate it, Congresswoman.